A man in southwest suburban Berwyn was arrested for making death threats against people who were involved in this unresolved case. Now our investigative reporter Chuck Gowdy in studio revealing that Berwyn man's violent history and has the first photos of this accused threat maker. Chuck.
You do, Allison. Stephan, the Berwyn man's name is Edward James Porter, now facing federal charges in the Nolan Wells case for allegedly threatening to murder witnesses and their family members.
First, an 18-year-old Nolan Wells goes on a boat with friends on a holiday weekend in Mississippi and never comes home. Second, his body is found 2 days later, face down in the water on a beach no one can seem to agree about what happened. Third, a man from Chicago with no known connection to Nolan, no ties to Mississippi, no reason to care, gets arrested. And then federal prosecutors start building a case against him for threatening to murder witnesses in a case he has nothing to do with. By the time we're done here, we'll have separated what we actually know about Edward James Porter, what law enforcement documented against him, and the much bigger story hiding underneath, which is about how conspiracy narratives don't die when evidence contradicts them. They just find new people to pull in. This is what happens when a case sits unresolved and the gap between what's documented and what people believe becomes a vacuum. Let's start with the facts. On July 4th, 2026, the heat index hit its peak on Horn Island, Mississippi. Nolan Wells, 18 years old, was there with friends. He took a boat ride. He didn't come back with them. 2 days later, authorities found his body in the water. The medical examiner ruled it a drowning. The investigation, by all available public record, did not produce criminal charges. No arrest, no suspect named, no charges filed. And because there was no resolution, because the case sat there unresolved, the space filled with something else. Civil rights organizations raised questions. His family raised questions. People on social media, people on podcasts, people in comment sections, they all started filling in the blank, because a blank space in the public record is an invitation to narrative. And narratives, once they start, they don't need evidence to travel. They need repetition. That's the context for what happened next. That's the context for Edward James Porter. Federal prosecutors in Mississippi filed charges against Edward James Porter, 33 years old, from Berwyn, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. The charges: threatening to murder witnesses in the Nolan Wells case, threatening to murder their family members, threatening to murder police. According to the federal complaint, Porter also threatened to cut up one of the witnesses and stuff the remains into a suitcase.
Porter is also accused by federal prosecutors of threatening to cut up one witness and stuff.
The cell phone records obtained by federal agents showed a trail. Calls from Porter's phone to Mississippi numbers, IP addresses linked to his Berwyn apartment, a digital footprint. The investigators had something concrete. It wasn't a theory. It was data.
Mississippi. The case against him, according to U.S. investigators, has a trail of cell phone calls from Porter to Mississippi witnesses and IP addresses, all linked.
Porter was arrested, transferred by U.S. Marshals to Mississippi, and he's scheduled to appear in Gulfport on September 3rd. This is his first federal charge.
Berwyn police accompanied federal agents with the Chicago FBI field office apprehension team. According to Berwyn police records that NBC5 investigates,
but here's where we have to pause, because the question everyone wants answered is not about the threats. The question is, who is Edward James Porter? And why does someone with no documented connection to Nolan Wells, no history in Mississippi, no stated reason to care about this case at all, insert himself so deeply that he makes federal charges necessary? The answer is in his record. Cook County records, which NBC Chicago obtained, show that Porter's arrests began in 2011. He's been arrested 20-plus times in the 15 years between then and now.
Investigation of Porter's past finds a Metro Chicago man repeatedly described by authorities as a threat to safety because of his numerous
domestic violence, breaking court orders of protection, theft, gun violence charges, assault, threat charges.
One thing, some of y'all ain't been married that long. Roll the clip.
Has to follow for domestic violence.
Almost all of them, the records show, were later dropped. Either the victim recanted, or they declined to testify, or the evidence wasn't sufficient to proceed. That's a legal outcome, not a judgment on guilt or innocence. But the pattern is there. He kept returning to the system. He kept being released.
Think about this. white people so bad in America and racism is so bad in America that when a black boy died, black people threaten to kill people. Like, what? I just don't understand. And then they go, the system is against us. Look at this mother track record. Look at his arrest record, bruh. Some of y'all ain't had a job this long. Some of y'all ain't consistently been on a job this many years. He is consistently breaking the law and getting out of jail. What happened to black people when they get in trouble, they get wet? Look at this.
There's one incident in particular that matters. Porter had an Illinois firearm owner's card and a handgun. The record states that he was taken into custody when he threatened his ex-girlfriend. His exact words, according to the report, were, "I'm going to shoot you."
Porter had an Illinois firearm owner card and a handgun that were taken from him when police say he threatened his ex-girlfriend, quote.
The charges were later dropped when she chose not to proceed. It's unknown whether his firearm card and the handgun were returned to him. That gap in the record matters because it suggests that this isn't a man who was suddenly drawn into the Nolan Wells narrative by curiosity. This is a man with a documented history of threats, of violence, of access to weapons, who was circulating through a system that, according to the records, kept releasing him, kept giving him second chances, kept moving him forward. And then, at some point, he decided to make calls to Mississippi. Now, here's where we need to talk about what actually happened as a result of those calls. Federal agents arrested Edward James Porter, and that arrest is documented. It's public, it's real. But there's a wider pattern that people aren't talking about as much. According to the video evidence from NBC Chicago and statements made in the source material, Porter is not the first person arrested in connection with the Nolan Wells case. The reporting indicates that 4 or 5 people have now been arrested, all of them for making threats. Some of those threats were directed at the young men who were on the boat with Nolan. Some of those threats were directed at the families of those young men. And some of those threats were directed at people who, according to the available reporting, had nothing to do with the case at all, but became targets simply because they were perceived as sympathetic to the accused. That's a documented pattern. 4 or 5 arrests. Federal charges for one of them. But here's the complication, and this is where the narrative starts to crack. By the same available reporting, no one has been arrested, no charges have been filed against anyone for making threats against Nolan's family members. The family, according to statements made publicly, has said that they received threats. But the threshold for federal prosecution, apparently, was not met. The threats did not rise to the level of documented criminal conduct, or they were not reported in the same way, or the evidence was not sufficient to proceed. We don't know which, but the asymmetry is there. People defending the accused boys faced federal prosecution.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Let's get to an arrest that was made. Now, mind you, when you're looking at this impartially and you're saying, why does these white boys need attorneys? Why are these white boys doing interviews? Why are their parents doing GoFundMes and all this stuff?
Nolan's family faced threats, but not prosecution. That's not a judgment. That's just what the record shows.
And so people who think that these white boys killed Nolan, when there's no evidence that happened, are now threatening to kill these white boys, their family, and they have been arrested. We have seen not one arrest.
The question this raises is a real one, and it's worth sitting with. Why does false accusation seem to travel faster through a community than the actual evidence? Why do narratives about injustice, once they start, seem to attract people like Edward James Porter, who have no connection to the original crime, but a documented history with violence and threats?
1,000 times of jumping to racism when race is not even apparent or there's no evidence of race. And then I'm watching what appeared to be innocent people being.
The answer isn't simple, and I'm not going to pretend it is. Part of it is that conspiracy narratives and false accusations, they don't require proof. They require resonance. They require that you felt wronged by a system, by law enforcement, by get justice, that the system is rigged. And then a case like this comes along, unresolved, unexplained, a blank space in the public record. And it fills the narrative that's already inside you. You don't need to know Nolan Wells. You don't need to have any connection to Mississippi. You don't need to have any actual information about what happened. What you need is to believe that you're part of something bigger, that you're on the right side, that you're making a difference. And if that belief pulls you far enough away from reality, you end up making federal crimes. You end up getting arrested in your apartment in Illinois by the FBI, scheduled for prosecution in Mississippi, facing the first serious charges of your life. That's Edward James Porter's story. That's what the record shows. But there's another part of this that matters, because it speaks directly to how these cases are covered, how they're discussed, how they move through media, and how the gap between what's documented and what's believed keeps getting wider. When a narrative takes hold in public discourse, especially a narrative about injustice, about race, about the system being rigged, it develops a gravitational pull. It pulls in people, it pulls in content, it pulls in theories, it pulls in interpretations. And the original question, the thing that started it all, gets buried under the weight of everything else. The original question in this case is simple: how did Nolan Wells die? The medical examiner said drowning. But because the case is unresolved, because there's no public confession, no trial, no definitive statement from authorities about what happened, people filled the space with alternatives: murder, racial violence, conspiracy, cover up, the media by power structures. They require that you already believe that people like you don't
know if Nolan got hit in the back of the head. We don't know if the blood simply drained to the back of the head. But
Pause. Let me tell you what these mindless people, what the problem is, what they don't do is they don't go to the next step. They do this in Charlie Kirk's case. You said he got strangled and murdered.
And once those narratives are in circulation, they don't go away. They don't wait for evidence. They don't care about the medical examiner's report. They don't care about the investigator's lack of charges. They just keep moving, and they pull people into them. People like Edward James Porter.
Roll the clip.
I believe Nolan was deceased before he hit the water. And the reason they held on to the throat tissue and the reason they held on to the lung tissue is they didn't want nobody to know that Nolan was murdered before he hit that water. Just like Emmett Till was murdered before he hit that water. Just like Dr. King's brother, A.D. King, was murdered before he hit that water. Remember, Art, when Dr. King's brother was murdered, Reverend A.D. King, they found him in a swimming pool.
To put the math equation together, why would the district attorney, for the medical examiner, risk his or her, I believe it could be a her, risk her entire career to lie about one kid? And we already know that Warren, whose stepmother is a judge, wasn't there. Jax wasn't there. Morgan wasn't there. Bart has an attorney and he's suing out of all y'all that lied on him. He had nothing to do with it. So we know all the boys that they put out on the media. Katie, it appears Katie has nothing to do with it. Everybody that they put out there in the media seems to have nothing to do with it. So why would the medical examiner lie, risk her career and go into prison to lie about one kid? That was an incredible kid that everybody loved. That it appears that nobody did anything to. He just drowned.
Here's what we actually know: Edward James Porter made documented threats. He has a documented history of threats. He inserted himself into a case he had no connection to. He was arrested. Federal charges were filed. That happened. That's real. That's what the record shows. But the bigger story, the one that people aren't talking about enough, is that this is what happens when a case doesn't resolve. This is what a failure to resolve looks like, not in terms of investigative capacity, but in terms of what it does to a community, what it does to people, what it does to the narrative space. And the question that matters, the one that the record doesn't fully answer, is this: how many Edward James Porters are out there? How many people with histories of violence, with nothing to lose, with a need to be part of something, are being pulled into cases like this because the narratives around those cases are the most compelling story they're encountering? That's worth thinking about. That's worth discussing. What we know about Edward James Porter, what the documented record shows, is that he's a man with a long history of system involvement, of arrests, of threats, of charges that mostly didn't stick. He's a man who at some point called witnesses in Mississippi. He's a man who made threats. He's a man who got arrested for it. And now he's facing federal prosecution. That's the story. That's what the evidence supports.
County Jail in 2025. But records we've obtained show Porter's criminal history began years earlier, in 2011.
The other story, the one about Nolan Wells, about how he died, about whether there was injustice in that death, whether that death was motivated by race, whether the system failed, that story is still unresolved. And it's going to stay unresolved until someone in a position of authority, someone with access to actual investigation, provides a clear answer. Until then, the blank space will keep pulling people in. Edward James Porter was arrested on the charges related to the threats. That happened. That's documented. He's due in Gulfport on September 3rd.
Detained under the Freedom of Information Act, Porter did not put up a fight. He's due at a Gulfport, Mississippi courtroom on September 3rd. That'll be the first time he's seen.
He has a defense, presumably. He'll have his day in court. That's the system. But the bigger failure, the one that allowed his story to happen in the first place, that's on all of us. It's on media. It's on social platforms. It's on the way we treat unresolved cases as invitations to narrative rather than as real events that require real answers. Stay with us. We're going to keep digging into how cases like this move through the system, how narratives overtake facts, and what it actually takes to separate documented evidence from belief. The Nolan Wells case is far from over, and so is the story of who gets pulled into its orbit. If you see something in the record that we missed, if you have a documented source that changes the picture, let us know in the comments. That's how we keep this honest.